Gentlemen, please a big round of applause for SCHR, who has 2 hours in the next session.
Good afternoon. I hope you have noticed that the colors have changed in the room. The banners have changed. I would like to thank Murray for having these done. They're absolutely gorgeous. It's the first time I see an SCHR banner, and I'm really delighted. So thank you, Murray. You can't hear me? Ah, sorry. Okay. Welcome to this afternoon's session. We're going to be sharing with you the findings and the recommendations from the certification review project, which came to an end at the end of September, which was a 2-year project aimed at exploring the relevance and the feasibility of certification for humanitarian NGOs. We're then going to propose a way forward to you, following which we'll have a question and answer session. And then we will be putting a few, hopefully challenging questions to you to examine within your tables. And we will finish with a panel of some of my colleagues representing agencies from SCHR, responding to some of your issues from the perspective of their agencies. And we will then try, attempt to bring the session to a close, sort of focusing on some of the key issues which have come out. By the way, I'm Kate Half. I'm the Executive Secretary for SCHR. My colleague Philip Laminga, was the project coordinator for the certification review project. So he's the person who drove and led the project. And I'm going to hand the floor over to him immediately for an overview of the findings and recommendations.
Can you hear me? Better? Okay, good. So we will spend the next little while, 20 minutes or so, going through the findings and recommendations from this 2-year process. And again, just a reminder that it's to give you a sense of what we collectively have accomplished over the last 2 years, because many of you, or most all of you here in this room, contributed very extensively to this process, and many thanks to that. We want to think about what the implications are for the sector, in particular, I think, in relation to the CHS, which we talked about this morning, and think about also decision-making about how to move forward. So that's the session's structure for today. So what's the claim? What is this idea about certification? When the SCHR decided to look at this process, beginning about 2 years ago, was a lot of discussion and debate experience within the sector around the topic of certification. And the claim basically behind any certification mechanism is that it's going to improve the quality of products or processes or services. So in this context, the claim is that certification will lead to better, more consistent humanitarian action. And as SCHR members, many of them engaged in other certification-like processes, it was an opportunity to kind of reflect on this in conjunction with the reflection around standards for the sector and see how these things link together, and can that claim actually be supported? Can we look into that in a bit more detail and try to find some evidence for that? And if that's the case, what would be the most appropriate and relevant model for this sector? So that's the claim. And what we did is quite an extensive, similar to the CHS process, a very extensive consultation process with stakeholders, hundreds and hundreds of interviews and submissions from organizations and individuals. We did focus group sessions. We did an extensive literature review of what's happened in the sector and from other sectors familiar with standards and certification schemes. And we looked at the field level 4 case studies in Ethiopia, in Pakistan, DRC, and the Philippines. And in those case studies, what we tried to do is take all the inputs that we had from stakeholders about what they thought the role and purpose of certification could be. We put that into a model, and then we went out to the field level and tried to understand at the organization level, what would the implications be, and at the national level, what would the implications be? And all that kind of comes together in the summary findings that you have in your package today. Also, just a reminder, though, that on the SCHR website, there are additional discussion and analysis papers that will also help give you more detailed and in-depth understanding of what we looked at, and including the case studies. So, I think, just to summarize then the key findings, the question then, does it lead to results? And our conclusion is that yes, certification can lead to better results. It can. The evidence from existing processes within the sector, like HAP and People in Aid, but also at the country level from ACFID, Interaction and others, demonstrate that it can have an impact in terms of improving organizational processes, reinforcing quality and accountability systems. And that is a finding that's widely backed from our research into other sectors as well. Certification processes can lead to better results. That said, not all the evidence is there about long-term impact. And so we have to also recognize that there are limitations. There's gaps in the research. But on the whole, the bulk of the experiences that we looked at suggest that there's enough linkages between standards and certification processes to make a conclusion that it's very likely that these will lead to results. What we also found quite interestingly in terms of this process was the sense that certification processes can reinforce and rebuild trust and transparency. And when we talk to different stakeholder groups, particularly governments in our field case studies, this is one of the key issues that they were concerned about, that the level of trust and confidence that they could have in NGOs. And many of them welcomed the sense of having an internal or an independent certification process to help give them assurances that NGOs were professional, credible, competent at doing their work. But that also was a strong message from many, many of the NGOs, particularly at the national level, who talked about this is a way for us to rebuild trust with our stakeholders, our donors, but more importantly with our communities, because it shows them that when we say or claim that we're working with them in accountable, effective manners, we have some independent evidence to back that up. Now, looking at the actual model, and there's a couple of things that I want to stress. We did this process in parallel to the CHS process, and we had a lot of back and forth about sharing our learning and findings with each other. And the model that we put out and we tested at the field level was based on many of the similar criteria that are now reflected in the CHS. In fact, those 9 commitments are almost identical to the kind of commitments and expectations that stakeholders had when we asked them, what do you need or what would you like to see from a professional, credible organization? So all those commitments that are in the CHS were very, very similar to the ones that we gathered from stakeholders and that we were able to test at the field level. And the model itself is feasible. It's achievable, it can be implemented, it's affordable, and it's complementary, I think, to other processes. It actually, I think, adds value. And this is our conclusion, again, from the 2 years process. Now, I want to stress this next point a lot, though. It's complementarity. One of the key messages we heard from people, and it's very similar to the CHS message around harmonization and simplification and alignment. What we did, especially in the field case studies, was to try to compare the criteria for assessing an organization, for verifying and potentially certifying an organization, with what is already in place by donors, by host governments, UN agencies, funding agencies, and in some cases the existing codes of practice of NGOs and other networks. And the model is compatible. This is a really important message because it suggests that there's an opportunity, like with the CHS, of looking at existing processes, whether they're internal processes as an organization or ones that they participate in externally, and being able to show that they're compatible, that there's alignment, And there's no need necessarily to create a whole new separate system. It's a system that can recognize and validate and build on and complement these other processes. The other critical point of information for us was to assess, to gauge the level of interest and support in certification. And one of the criticisms of existing models is that they have had, up until the moment at least, very limited scale, very limited level of participation. And so we were also trying to assess feasibility from the sense of, is there enough demand and interest to move forward on a new approach towards certification? And the answer is yes. And I think the answer was quite surprising for me, at least, with hearing that and had the level or the number of national level NGOs who saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate to their own stakeholders that they have developed their capacity to meet internationally agreed standards. They wanted certification as a recognition and a validation of the efforts that they had made to gain experience and become more and more professional. Similarly, lots of international NGOs talked about certification as an added value to them, about being able to validate their own efforts to build strong, robust internal quality assurance processes. And it was an opportunity for them also to use certification as a complement and a validation tool for what they were already doing. So enough interest to move forward, but this is, I think, the critical question. We could move forward. We can build a verification and certification system based around the CHS, but the support and participation is critical for the success. And critical in many regards. Support not just being the participation of NGOs, but support from external stakeholders who NGOs work with, donor governments, UN agencies, host governments that they work with, to make sure that they recognize and support and acknowledge and validate the efforts that go into an organization going through certification. And participation, critical. We think that it's really important to achieve a critical mass of organizations participating in order for this to be able to demonstrate impact and to become a platform for change. What we see in other sectors, for example, is that when enough organizations participate in a certification scheme, they begin to, first of all, create a community of knowledge and sharing that helps to stimulate good practice and learning, but they also shape and influence how the rest of the sector works as well. And this is really important. So a critical mass of participation and sustained support. The sustained support is also quite important. This cannot be an initiative that starts today and ends a year later from now. In order for this to be successful, to have impact, to generate the kind of results and meet the expectations of stakeholders, we need a long-term commitment, 5 or 10 years, to make sure that this has enough support behind it to be able to generate the results that we would want from it. Now, there are a few caveats. And I hope you'll see them in the papers if you've had a chance to read them. First, certification when it's not relevant for every NGO. There will be many, many NGOs who, for many different reasons, will say, we're not quite interested in certification. And that's fine. That's perfectly reasonable. There's just as many, or even more, who want certification, so we have to respect both of those sets of opinions. Now, the organizations might decide that this is not going to add value for them. They might decide that they're not ready for it. They might decide that perhaps they want to spend more time building their systems and capacities before working towards certification. And that's fine as well. They might choose, because of positions, to not go for certification. That's fine. But there is a strong, significant interest, and we have to recognize and find a kind of a way of balancing those two different views. Really, really important. Expectations sometimes or about what certification can and cannot do are unrealistic. It cannot solve some of the many difficult structural, political issues facing the humanitarian sector. Certification in and of itself is not going to resolve those problems. It can be a tool, along with other tools, to help work towards finding solutions to those problems. But in and of itself, it's not a solution to that. It's not necessarily a solution to funding issues, because we've heard a lot of expectations around certification equating to access to funding. That's not necessarily the case. There's a long way to go about reforming the way donors channel their aid and their assistance to NGOs, how they make it more equitable and accessible. Now, certification may be a tool, but it's not the solution to resolving some of those issues as well. And it's not a replacement for other structures or processes. It's not a replacement for an organization doing its own work at building its internal quality assurance processes and systems. It's not a replacement for monitoring and evaluation, which is so critical for an organization to be able to demonstrate that it's meeting its objectives. But it's also not a replacement, and I make this point perhaps particularly to donors in UN. We heard very, very strongly that certification of NGOs shouldn't be the end of the conversation about mutual or joint accountability. And there's not a replacement then for other processes where we want to encourage governments, UN agencies and others to also play their part in being more accountable and more effective. Again, it's a tool, and it's a tool that goes in conjunction with other tools and processes and initiatives that we have in the sector. Now, and what we heard also about what the system should look like, it has to be voluntary. There should be no obligation for any organization to go through a certification process. It should be based on the organization's determining for itself whether or not it's the right time and if it adds value to their work. Open and accessible and affordable to all. We think we've done some initial costing analysis, and we think that it can be affordable to most NGOs, but it's quite likely that some smaller NGOs are going to need support to help them in the transition of building their capacity and working towards meeting certification criteria. And that's really important to keep that in mind. So when we talk about sustained commitment, it's also about committing to local partners in the case of international NGOs. It's a commitment from donors and others to make sure that this is an accessible, affordable system. Flexible and adaptable. Absolutely critical that every organization we talked about making sure it's contextualized to each organization and to each crisis that they work in. So a one-size-fits-all system of certification is not relevant or useful for the sector. People want a flexible approach. They want to be able to take the criteria and show how they're being applied by their organization in this context. They don't want to simply, yes, you comply, no, you don't. They want to have an appreciation of how difficult humanitarian work is, an appreciation of the difficulties of the context that they're working in. And it has to be sustainable. Sustainable both in terms of level of participation, but also the long-term support. Only if those conditions are in place will the model be successful. And most important of all, and this is perhaps where most of our current initiatives have basically fallen down, is providing benefits and results, measuring and providing that evidence of that. It has to be built into the system so that we can, first of all, improve the system as we work towards implementing it. And this is, I think, the same for the CHS. But also to be able to show the results, and through showing the results, get more buy-in and participation in the system. So, now I've been talking about certification, but maybe a quick reminder of what it is. All it is really is a declaration that an organization has gone through an independent external objective assessment process, and that there's a declaration that gives assurances that the organization has met the criteria that are set out in the standard. So in other words, it's just a piece of paper. Get all worried about certification. It in itself is just a piece of paper. It's only the end product of a longer process and a much more important process around quality assurance. And that's the important thing that we want to talk about. It's a whole process of working towards verifying and demonstrating, providing evidence that you're meeting the quality assurance commitments. And for most sectors, it's an evolutionary process. We start with social norms, thinking about what we should be doing and how we should be doing things. They normally tend to become codified into standards. We then often move in many sectors towards self-reporting and self-assessment. Sometimes peer reviews and evaluations are used. And over time, normally, you move, as the sector matures and becomes more professional, to include third-party verification as one of all of these different tools that you can use as an organization to demonstrate to your stakeholders that they can have confidence in you and to demonstrate that you've got processes in place for quality assurance. And the design really depends on the function. What we heard from stakeholders is that some of them want this for branding and positioning. We heard earlier from some of the organizations talking about being able to distinguish themselves as professional, credible, principled, and accountable humanitarian actors compared to others. And so branding and positioning is actually quite important for some organizations. We also heard quite a number of people, particularly at the field level, saying we have to have more compliance. We have all these great standards, we have these commitments and codes, but there's no mechanism to demonstrate or provide evidence that people are complying with them. We need a system that helps ensure compliance. But far and above, the most important function that people want and expect from a certification mechanism is around learning. So this becomes a tool to help organizations systematically identify where they're doing well, how they're doing well, and where they can improve. So that the goal is not to receive that piece of paper certificate. The goal is to demonstrate your commitment to a process of continuous improvement and to measure and monitor yourself against that and to have that externally validated and verified through an objective, systematic process. So that's the model that we heard stakeholders want for the sector. It includes elements of compliance. It includes some elements of positioning and branding. But most importantly, they want to see it as an opportunity, a tool to help them as individual organizations to systematically improve and as a sector to improve. So what's different in the model that we're proposing? We're proposing a model, first and foremost, and I have to stress this over and over again, it's what stakeholders told us was important. So it's not me or SCHR saying, this is the model. It's what stakeholders have told us is important. And I think this is important. What's distinguishing this proposed model is that it builds on the CHS. We have now an agreed set of standards that are comprehensive. They're designed through a comprehensive process of consultation. They cover many, many elements of an organization's processes and practices. And it's around verifying continuous improvement against the CHS. What's different is also, and I say here because most people will be familiar with the HAT model, it's not just about accountability. I think the CHS is broad enough to also include what we heard is really, really critical from organizations about the timeliness, the effectiveness, the appropriateness of assistance. And so it includes issues around performance and results, and also about capacity and competencies, that organizations actually have the sufficient technical capacity and competency to deliver quality, effective aid. Affected people have always been part of, I think, well, I should not say that. They've become more and more important in our sector. We sometimes forget that. But affected people being part of systematically the verification process and making sure that, as the CHS has made clear, making this more people-centered. So maybe making sure that there's opportunities for them to engage, but not just affected people, other stakeholders at the local level, other stakeholders who are engaged with their organization to help them participate in verification process. Also recognizing and validating existing processes. Again, in all of the case studies where we looked in detail to organizations, All of them had different ways, in fact, of approaches about how they dealt with program management and how they dealt with needs assessments and how they did accountability mechanisms. And all of them, we found in most cases, were valid. So it's recognizing and validating that those processes meet the criteria or meet the spirit and the intent behind the CHS. And that's important because we don't want imposing a new separate system. We don't want to ask organizations to come up with a whole new set of management processes. We want to recognize and validate what they already have in place. And complement what already donors and governments and UN processes. That was really, really important as well. We heard just from this morning's session about how the government of Mexico has legislation that is very, very complementary to the CHS. And if, again, a system can demonstrate where that complementary is, there's a better opportunity that we can look at harmonizing or at least recognizing and validating those processes, and in the long term, perhaps harmonize and streamline some of them. So, cutting down now to the recommendations, what we're suggesting is that in accordance with international norms and standards, that any verification and certification body should be separate from the standards body. This is a standard procedure, and we think it's important for the credibility, the independence, the impartiality, objectivity of any verification or certification process. We're also suggesting that it doesn't make sense to look at this as a slow pilot process, but if we're going to make this successful, we have to try to scale up as quickly as possible to achieve a critical mass. And by critical mass, we're talking about maybe between 200 and 300 NGOs in the first 4 or 5 years of a new certification system. Once you get that, then you have the power to influence. We will also be recommending that you mobilizing resources, particularly for the startup phase of both the CHS, but also any certification or verification body, and particularly paying emphasis or attention to the interest and demand from smaller NGOs who want to go through certification processes, but might not have all the resources necessary to do that. We also would like to recommend a fast-track process to make sure that there's a mutual recognition and validation. Now, for example, at the country level in places like Australia, there is a certification process already in place. In the US, they have interactions, a private voluntary self-certification system, and we have to find a way of recognizing and validating those processes to make sure that there's interoperability and compatibility. And that's another way of making sure that we get that critical mass. Building political support and commitment, absolutely essential. Glad to see representatives of governments here and UN agencies, but we also have to do quite a bit of work on making sure that this message is disseminated quite further out. And I think looking up to the World Humanitarian Summit, making sure that people understand that this actually has value and that there's interest in the sector. And as I said before, from the beginning, right from the design stage, building in a systematic process to collect evidence and build a case to both improve the standard, the CHS standard, but also the means of verification, and to build evidence about how it's having an impact. And my final recommendation is that too often when we talk about these things here, it's a conversation amongst friends, colleagues. And like the CHS, I think it's also quite important that we raise awareness about, if we want to go forward with the certification mechanism, that we're also making sure that the general public knows and use this as a tool to help demonstrate that as a sector, organizations are becoming more and more professional, they're credible, they're reliable, and that they're meeting criteria. So I'll stop here and pass the mic to Kate to talk about what we're thinking about as a proposed roadmap forward.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'm going to be, I hope, very brief. This is what the project has come up with. These are the findings, these are the recommendations. So the big questions for us in SCHR was, okay, what do we do with this? How do we want to move forward? And in our discussions within SCHR, we also thought it's really important that we have this discussion with other stakeholders, other groups, other bodies who have a stake in certification. So we've been discussing very closely with HAP and People in Aid, the certification components. We've been discussing very closely with DNIDA, with SDC and with DFID, who funded the certification review project, to make sure that we came up with something which worked for all of us in terms of different constituencies, whilst very much in line with the recommendations from the project. I should maybe have started by saying that from our perspective, it was very clear that the proposal from the project was something which we felt was worth investing in, which we felt there are risks attached. It's a long-term vision. It will need sustained engagement over a period of time by a number of actors, but it's very clear that there's enough interest by different groups to potentially make it work. So the big question is, how do we move forward? It's very clear from our perspective that we want to promote and facilitate the creation of this body, this independent body, which would be focusing on external verification and certification against the CHS along the lines of those described by the project. We would like to make sure that this body is independent and perceived to be independent from the governance and the structures which manage the CHS standard. That, as Philip has told us, is something which is absolutely essential in terms of success. We also want this body to be operating against a business model which really puts it forward as a professional, impartial, competent body. So we want to make sure that it's accredited under existing international norms to be carrying out certification, and we want to make sure that it's a member of one or more of the international certification bodies. We want to make sure that it's got a business model which makes it sustainable, and based on the initial estimations which have been taken forward by Philip as part of his work, and which are again available on our website, we think that with a critical mass of organizations engaging in the process, it could potentially be sustainable within a 5 to 6 year period. And that, we think, should be the objective that we work towards. So, being relatively clear that that's what we want to achieve, how do we go about it? I've said that it's really important that this body be independent and be perceived as independent. So how do we create an independent body without appearing to be sort of controlling it or taking it over? So we've had, as I said, a number of discussions, and we've come up with a roadmap, which I've photocopied here and is available for distribution. So I can either take it around or you can come and help yourselves, or a combination of both, which is basically mapping a way forward for the interested parties. At the moment, as I said, it's SCHR, it's the HAP component, which deals with certification and People in Aid. It's SDC and DNIDA. But we very much hope that as a result of our discussion today, a lot more people will be coming to us and say, listen, we want to be part of facilitating the creation of this body. So what we think we need to do is, as a first step, we need to facilitate the creation of an independent board. And a board which basically represents the different competencies that this organization needs to be able to demonstrate. And that basically, once that board is created and a legal existence for the organization set up, remember it has to be an independent, self-standing organization, that basically the executive decisions are made by that board, and it then starts following its momentum of its own. So this is very much a call for interested parties to work with us at coming up with the best board possible for this organization. Ideally, we would like that board to be up and running by March, April, May at the very, very latest, for the organization to start being able to move forward. Now, this roadmap is not just about the creation of the board and the creation of the organization. It's also about all the advocacy, lobbying, convincing, dialoguing, which we all need to have with other NGOs, with other governments, be they donors or affected governments, with the UN, to make sure that this critical mass, this sort of political momentum is created. Ideally, we would like to reach, between now and the World Humanitarian Summit, a situation whereby at least 20, and this could probably be higher, but at least 20 diverse organizations, big, small, east, est, west, north organizations, have started engaging with the process. so that we can arrive at the World Humanitarian Summit with a fully fledged scheme which is functioning and already a bit of evidence as to what it means for an organization to start engaging in that. And we would very much like to use the World Humanitarian Summit as the sort of forum whereby we launch this in the whole world and hopefully make it known and hopefully get quite a lot of support from different actors around that. So this roadmap is very much a bit of a sort of advocacy map, sort of highlighting what are the key milestones between now and the World Humanitarian Summit, which are opportunities to promote and to engage with different stakeholders around this idea. So I will end now reminding you that what I would like to see come out of this, for those of you who are potentially interested or who think that you've got very strong ideas as to how you want this or you don't want this to go up, please get in touch with us so that you can be part of the team which is hopefully going to facilitate the creation of this new mechanism. Thank you very much.
How about we open for a few questions of clarification to Kate and Philip?
So, Arne Wiki, thank you very much, Phil and Kate, for the excellent presentation. Where I don't see it very clearly yet is in terms of the evolution of the whole Core Humanitarian Standards project, which should be the basis of the certification and the certification project. Because as it was said, these are two different pieces, but at the end they somehow converge. And the related question to that is, obviously I understand your case that you make, we need two independent bodies. And that makes totally sense, especially in if you think about regulation that is enforced. But here, with learning being so much in the forefront of what you try to achieve, I wonder whether that case to have absolutely an independent organization completely separate from the Core Humanitarian Standard, if that case is so solid. And if you could explain it a little bit more, because I don't know all the background, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Just a quick answer on that. I mean, there's a difference between operational and governance independence and collaboration. And I would think that you can maintain, just like the ICRC is an independent organization, but still obviously collaborates and engages the system. There's lots of ways of you can have collaboration and share learning. In fact, one of the advantages of an external verification body is that it can feed that learning back into the CHS. It can help improve that. It can provide some of the evidence and the documentation of how organizations are applying that. So it becomes a way of sharing information so they're not mutually exclusive. I think that answers the part of your question. Yeah.
Just to add on that, I think, the point is the two processes are linked because you don't have certification without the CHS. But the CHS is a standalone product, and I think it's really important that organizations who are not in favor or who are not interested at this stage in external verification or certification do not feel that they are being driven in that direction by the amalgamation of the two. So I think there's also there is a good practice approach, which means that in terms of a good practice, you don't mix the two for avoiding conflict of interest, but there's also a sort of pragmatic recognition that people within the sector have different objectives and have different relations to standards. And I think it's really important that we do not try and impose a link between the standards, the external verification, and the certification for those who do not want to have that link.
Hi. I have not questions, it's two comments. First comment is regarding the business model. I have reservation on this because In previous sessions, several times, the term quote unquote civil society has mentioned. We have to understand why the emergence of civil society. It is not for profit, or it is not for, or I cannot say that this is some sort of in between business and volunteerism. So if there will be business model, then sometime this will lead to a profit or something else. So especially in respect of certification in civil society, in respect of humanitarian organization, if we don't go for this model, then it will be a danger that the private, especially the accounting and audit firm, will come up, which basis is for certification only for the profit. This is one reservation. Another one reservation, it is in between flexibility and means of verification or measurable indicator for verifications. Because there are some issues which is, I respect the local context, but there are some issues which is related to the universality. Sex, for example, if you don't consider it otherwise, sexual harassment, complaint response mechanism, especially that I am part of the world that where my local context considered, don't spell about the sexual harassment. And so the universe, when it comes, there must be some sort of universality of some of the basic common minimum standard which must be verifiable, which must be universal. So we should not give the local context as an excuse to not to do something.
Just to reassure Reza and others, we did look at many different other options and models, and including kind of the ISO and commercial auditing type of things. And we found that actually experiences within the humanitarian sector was that using commercial auditors was often very, very expensive, and that commercial auditing firms had very little understanding about the complexities and the nature of humanitarian work. And so we discarded that as an option, as it just didn't seem appropriate to the sector. And that, I think, is clear that this, when we say business model, we're talking about a non-profit organization but has a very clear orientation to providing high-quality professional verification services to those organizations that want it. So it's providing a good quality service in a sustainable, financially sustainable manner.
Thank you very much. My name is Meshesha. I am from Ethiopia. I'm representing the Ethiopian NGOs, both the international and the local one. Our umbrella is constituting more than 350 organizations. We welcome this process. We are actively engaged with the support of DCA, CAFOD, TROCRA, and the Christian Aid in rolling out of HUB and the people in the aid standards. So we are also involved in the process of this setting up the common humanitarian standards. My question is about the change management and the transition management relation issues. Now, although we don't see any radical shift in terms of the content of the standards, certain new elements are coming. So what is really expected as a part of change management from those organizations, those have been certified under the previous model, be it people in aid or HUB? This is the first question. The first question is, how are we going to go from the older to the new system? This is specifically transition management. I do see the requirement of the new, that has been clearly elucidated, but we need detailed information as to how we are really transiting from the previous model to the new one. What is the new model entailing on our part? What's really required, and what preparation is supposed to be done on our part, and also on those members of the community of change under this common humanitarian standard. I thank you very much.
I mean, as I said, there also has to be one of the key tasks as we make this transition is to look at those organizations who are currently certified under a HAP process and come up with protocols of what the transition will mean. So that we don't have the answers to all those questions yet, obviously. But it should be relatively straightforward, I think, for organizations because the CHS already includes most all of the elements of the HAP standards and elements from other things that most organizations already comply with. But that's a task that has to happen in terms of being able to demonstrate the compatibility of one to the other and to determine within a fair, kind of transparent, objective process how, if you met the criteria under an older system, how this would be recognized and validated under the new system. Again, that's one of the key tasks that would have to happen in the first year.
To press, oh, okay. Good afternoon to everybody. Khulud from Qatar Red Crescent. So happy to be here and very proud of the work and marvelous efforts that everybody have put in to have the launching today. I just was thinking loud and I just wanted to hear from you regarding the local NGOs and the national societies with the limited sort of funding that we have. And the limited resources that we have in terms of getting the certificate in the future. How do we get the help in terms of the resources? What sort of options do southern sort of community do have in terms of support, in terms of the limited budget? Who can help us in getting all that information into making the decision of whether we go for the certificate or don't? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, as you see through some of the reports, there's a number of different ways that we think we could help provide funding or support for smaller NGOs. One option might be to look at a kind of a pooled fund mechanism to make sure that this is an accessible system and an affordable system for others. The other is that, and we've already heard some international NGOs talking about how they would be interested in going through a verification and certification process and to provide longer term support to their partners to go through a similar process of building their capacity. I think what's really important is that the proposed approach is flexible enough to give organizations lots of time to work towards achieving certification if they want to. And the most important part, as I said, is not achieving the certificate as such, but is to engaging in a process within your organization and working with your partners and others to build your capacity to meet the CHS and the criteria against them. Another options that we looked at is perhaps doing kind of a joint verification exercises where some organizations in the country might be looked at the same time. So there's lots of different options and of course we'll have to explore them. But this is when I said again, long-term political and financial support from donors, at least in the first initial phases of this, is going to be quite important.
Thank you. Just to be said, there are a number of organizations which are not convinced yet by certification and very much concerned by the risk associated with certification. So I think it's important to remind that. And then I would really like to see certification as one mean to implement the CHS and not the mean to implement the CHS. So I was wondering whether you thought or tried to think about a system or an organization which could support not only certification, but maybe peer reviews, different types of implementation of the CHS. Certification being maybe one of them, but not the only one. Because you presented this different scale. Well, I don't know from where it comes. There are sectors in which there is no certification and where the peer review model is really helpful for learning. So, for example, the states in the OECD, they don't have a certification system, they have peer review. Yeah. So I was really wondering, why don't we think about an organization that could bring different kind of support to implement the CHS? Thank you.
That's a really important point, and I have to stress it again. Certification is just one of many different tools and options available, and some of them will be really helpful and useful for some organizations. Others might want to work towards external verification and certification. We did look, and certainly the SCHR has examples with peer reviews, and it can be a quite time-consuming and labor-intensive process for organizations who are already stretched to the limit sometimes in their operational work and their programming work. But there are ways of making these processes helpful. I know, for example, other organizations are using peer review mechanisms. It's a question of finding the right tools for the type of organization and the needs of that organization at the time, and absolutely complementary. And I would also expect and want to see that the organization that takes the CHS forward and an organization that works around external verification and certification work together at making sure that there's a whole range of complementary tools to help organizations implement them. So they're not yes or no mutually exclusive. I think they have to always be looked at as a range of different tools for to meet different needs.
Add that it's really not exclusive. I mean, the CHS organization will be supporting organizations, the standards organizations will be supporting organizations to implement the standards and coming up also with a verification framework, which will include a number of these tools. The certification is really about an independent, objective statement, which is confirming that the organization has been verified to meet its commitments. And I think a lot of different processes can feed into that final statement. So I don't think it's an either or. It's making sure that the system recognizes the different tools which are being used, and that provided they can be reviewed externally as a final part of the process, if an organization wants that external assessment.
My name is Vikrant from Sphere India. I'm representing a network of more than 50 organizations in India, and which is supporting provincial or state level networks, around 50 networks in India. And in outreach, I would say the mandate I have to represent here is more than 10,000 organizations in India. And as my job here, for which I'm here representing those, I think a large majority of these have apprehensions with this model and the system of verification and decertification. So I want to voice their view about it. They have apprehensions and concerns about it. Also, though I read the document, it talks about the model and the cost implications. I understand from the front end, absolutely front end grassroots NGOs, the model look cost is going to add to the burden of cost for these organizations. So that's one of the major concerns also is there. I also read in the paper that it talks about to build on the existing practices or in the local context, maybe involving existing certification processes or maybe other processes in the local context, but there is not enough information in the model proposed. It looked like a highly centralized model. You know, it doesn't come out clearly that how the decentralization and how the local processes will get empowered and take up more onto this. Maybe I think that's one thing which can address some of the concerns. So that's more a recommendation from my side. And also, in the end, I see this is maybe the timeline look maybe a little ambitious also in view of these concerns. If we defer the process or the timeline a little bit so that there are more reactions to this reaction and it's time to absorb this and people and these organizations, they get prepared. I think more investment initially is made on capacity building and awareness and buy-in of these things. So that's an appeal which I would like to make it here to be considered.
Thanks for that, Vikram. And again, the issues and concerns, we've done as much as we can with this project to try to identify how to make this a feasible, relevant, appropriate model for the sector. We don't have all the answers, so this is not tomorrow we start implementing it. I think we'll have to learn as we go. And for those organizations who still don't have kind of enough confidence or information to make a decision, there's a whole process that needs to go on both with the CHS and then also with issues around verification to make that information available and to help organizations make an informed decision. So it's not a kind of an immediate process. There are, and there is right now, currently sufficient interest and demand from a number of organizations to move almost immediately towards certification, including ones who are currently certified under HAP. So my hope is that those organizations will help to build also the learning about how the model could be practically realized and implemented, and then through that learning also build stronger arguments about how it could be used. And that includes about how to keep the costs as minimal as possible, how to find additional sources of funding, and most importantly, I hear and heard very clearly throughout these 2 years about the potential risks about certification. I think that the proposed design tries to mitigate many of those risks, but it has to be present at all times as we move from the concept and design to the actual implementation, that we're always conscious about the risks, about how certification could be misused or applied in a way that doesn't meet the aims of improving quality and accountability and effectiveness and achieves those criteria about being open, accessible and affordable to all.
Thank you. Is it working? Good. My name is Ejner Jensen from Denmark here, from the Humanitarian Department. I think the one view I want to share with you is that, first of all, it's great that we have the Common Humanitarian Standard. You've been working hard for it, and it's here, and we must use it. It's an opportunity that we cannot miss. And I can assure you that we will do our best to feed it into the World Humanitarian Summit together with you on the occasions, opportunities we have. Next thing I would say is this proposed certification mechanism, it must be a voluntary one, as I see it. It must be a voluntary one for everybody. I cannot see it be forced upon. But we must at the same time also realize that quite a number of organizations already are certified. So we need to provide a mechanism now with a new Common Humanitarian Standard for those who are certified, who wants to go that route and so on. Otherwise we lose an opportunity. And I can only say from the Danish side, we are prepared to hold the hand under the development of such a certification body. We do not have any stake in it or see it as we don't have any wish for what it should look like. It's a free setup. But we will, together with hopefully a number of other donors, provide some support. And that support should also be made for smaller NGOs who need support to get certified if they wish to be certified. That is my views right now, and I think we must move on in that direction. Otherwise we leave all those organizations behind who have taken that step. That for me is the best argument as I see it. Then there might be some donors and countries that want to take it further. I talked to you about that last night, that our previous minister had a very strong stand in Denmark that any Danish humanitarian NGOs must be certified. But that can be an individual step for each country or each individual to take. And it doesn't have to influence an overall voluntary scheme. Thank you.
One last question. Yeah.
Mamadou Ndiaye from OFADEC. I'm speaking as for an organization who certified twice and have certification model. My first question is about building on what Vikram said is about decentralization. Will you consider decentralization to allow a large process? I mean, having not just a limited number of NGOs, because if you have a decentralized process, for example, having capacity in the Congo to travel to the Congo Brazza, it will take just taking the ferry and get there and do the thing, instead of traveling from either US or someone else. So I'm just asking if you will consider, because it will be an important tool to democratize the process. The second thing is a question: will you consider peer review in your setting as one of the tools to get into certification? The third is having donors to fund this organization. Why, as a humanitarian organization, can't we get the necessary funding to do it? Because it may have implication that the body is funded by donors, and what donors do, will they accept also to be certified under these criteria? Because for Southern NGOs, we realize that as today, we have 1.6% of the whole humanitarian funds that go to national or local NGO. Are we, because it has implication also in all these things. It's a question of funding, but I think that is something we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou. And yes, the process of kind of decentralizing the process is actually quite important. And I would imagine over time that as enough experience and enough participation occurs, that it will become more and more easy to decentralize some of those functions to the regional and country level. But that said, it's the first step. I would hope, one of the things we've said here is that to make this work also you need a good, solid core of trained, competent assessors who understand the humanitarian system, but who also understand how to assess an organization from a learning approach, not a compliance approach as such. And I can very clearly imagine that many of those core group of assessors would come from representatives from each region of the world to make sure that people understand the context and the culture and the different countries that organizations that they would be reviewing. And again, this point about donors, I mean, I said at the beginning, it's unrealistic to expect certification by itself to change the nature of how the financial mechanisms that are currently in use by the international aid system. That said, I think in our field case studies, we found a lot of interest from donors and pooled fund mechanisms about taking, not using and making certification a requirement, but using the criteria and the CHS as a potential framework from which to help assess organizations for access to food funds. This is a longer term process. But once we get enough NGOs participating in this, and once we have enough critical mass, then it becomes really interesting as a platform for influencing and change behaviors of other actors. And I would hope and expect that donor governments, the UN agencies would also pay very, very close attention to this process and say, if NGOs are making a commitment to the CHS and they're making a commitment to verify themselves against that, we would also hope and expect and want them also to take part of their mutual responsibility and their mutual accountability to apply similar mechanisms to that. But that becomes a much more compelling argument when you have a critical mass of organizations and NGOs participating in this process.
I'd suggest we stop with the questions in plenary and actually move the discussion back down to the table, because I get the feeling it's more comments right now than questions are coming out. Can we do that? Is it a burning question you need an answer to? Yes? All right, one very last question.
Sir, thank you. My name is Iskandar. I come from Indonesian Society for Disaster Management. Just an update from Indonesia. This year there is a professional certification authority for disaster management. That is independent agencies who will certify the disaster management practitioner in my country. Your presentations give me insight on the certification process now, but my question is, as a person who is assigned to lead the accreditation in my country, so what can I do with this? Do you think that I can kind of copy the process to get inside the process in country level, or what? I'm still wandering around how to, you know, to put that in the national context. Thank you.
As I said, we've done as much as we could to identify the feasibility of this model and to think about what would make it successful. Now, quite a bit more work has to be done about making sure that there's opportunities of collaboration and compatibility with what's happening at the national level in places like Indonesia, and knowing that that there is this process going on in Indonesia. I would imagine the people in the organizations that take this forward will want to work very closely with you to try to identify those synergies and the opportunities of, again, going back to one of the factors of success, interoperability and comparability and alignment of different processes. I don't see that as incompatible. I see this as an opportunity, and I'm sure that the people who take this forward will be looking forward to working more closely with you on that.
I would just like, before we finish, just to use this point to really emphasize that one of the, from my perspective, selling points, quote unquote, of this model is the fact that it aims at building on what organizations are already doing. So if you are going through a certification process in Indonesia, this process would recognize that and sort of look at, is there any area which isn't already covered by your, and then add it or not. But the idea is really to avoid creating parallel systems or duplicating. We're also hoping, going back to the point that Philip made about a platform for to influence certain trends, the reality is that certification is already happening. It's happening increasingly so at the donor level, but also at the national level or the regional level. And potentially, as this develops, this could become a means to try and influence the direction that some of these certification mechanisms are taking, to make sure that we're looking at something which is globally compatible rather than very extreme cases from one environment to the other. It's obviously a very long-term vision, and it might be completely utopic, but hopefully it would help us move forward on that front also.
You have a template on your table. They reflect the questions that are on the screen. Could you take, say, 15 minutes at the table level and discuss these through and write some of them down, and we'll hear back from you. And we'll close the session off hearing back from some SCHR members on what you were saying, how that resonates with them. Does that work for a task?